Good morning. How are you guys? It's Friday morning. Hope you guys are chilling and enjoying the first day of your really long weekend. When you get a chance, I hope you get to doing your history homework. So let's get started talking about the South and the West after the conclusion of the Civil War. After the conclusion of the Civil War, the South was in shambles with its social, political, and economic system broken and with a need for a new vision. This would be provided by editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Henry Grady, who illustrated a new South as opposed to the old, where almost anything was possible. And you'll be reading a document that discusses this vision in the document booklet. One of the chief weaknesses during the Civil War was the South's lack of manufacturing centers. This would be changed in the New South, where factories and textile mills would spring up before the end of the century in record numbers. Although there was growth in manufacturing down in the South, agriculture still reigned and cotton was king. The reconstruction of the South and its rail lines improved the shipping of crops to market, and the introduction of the refrigerated rail car allowed produce to be shipped without spoiling. The old plantation system gave way to the tenant farmer or sharecropper. Farmers worked land that was not owned by them and would trade away a set percentage of their annual yield for the right to work the field in the next season. It's kind of a feudal system, but in theory, sharecroppers would receive their profit back. But unfortunately, it was affected by crop prices and drought and storms and all kinds of things that would oftentimes leave sharecroppers in debt to the property owners at the end of the year. Cash in the South was lacking, and credit was the only way that any of them could really survive at this point. If you look at this map, it shows the percentage of people engaged in sharecropping, and you can see how it was overwhelmingly part of the Southern way of life during this time, and how to farm all of those huge plantations that no longer had slave labor. Tenant farming was detrimental in many ways also. There were problems with the nutrients in the land. They hadn't really developed the science of keeping the nutrients in the soil, and tenant farmers would plant high-yield crops like corn in high demand. This practice drained the land of the nutrients vital for future seasons. In addition, fertilizers were used to expand the growing cycle, placing the land at a greater risk. This practice damaged the southern landscape and made the land useless. When the land was depleted, tenant farmers just moved on. Much damage was done to the South by this system. Politics in the South after the Civil War was much the same as it was before. A small group of Democrats, known as the Redeemers, were in charge, and they gave themselves credit for saving the South from the Yankee carpetbaggers, thus redeeming the South. Within the Redeemers was a group that was willing to make alliances with Northern conservatives when necessary. They were known as the Bourbons. The Southern Bourbons allied with Northeastern conservatives to create an economic alliance, focusing on cutting back the size and cost of government in the South. Jim Crow was a black-faced character in minstrel shows dating all the way back to the Jackson era. And he sang a song that went, "Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." And this became a slang term for the laws that get put in place in the South that lead to separation of the races. The act satirized the black slave behavior primarily for white audiences. So that slang term and that show led to a title for the set of laws that get put in place. Oppression of African Americans took place despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment being passed. During the 1890s in the South, a wave of violent anti-black sentiment ran rampant. Educating African Americans was viewed by many as a danger to the social order, and many feared it must be stopped to keep them in their place. New laws were enacted to prevent blacks from achieving their constitutional rights. These were known as Jim Crow laws and mandated the separation of the races in public places. Many states removed the rights of African Americans that the Reconstruction constitutions had forced white society after the war, and the states' governments often changed them back, or they would just ignore the new state constitutions that had been written. Just backtracking a little bit, the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, came about during Andrew Johnson's presidency. The 14th Amendment reaffirmed the state and federal citizenship of all persons regardless of race, born or naturalized in the United States, and it forbade any state to abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens, to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or to, quote, deny any person the equal protection of the laws, unquote. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied only to cases in which the state infringed on the rights of African Americans. So the federal government couldn't, the state couldn't. However, it became perfectly legal when an individual infringed on the rights of African Americans. In 1896, a case came to the Supreme Court named Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, he was 1/8 African, would not leave a whites-only railroad car in New Orleans. He was convicted of violating the segregation policy that had been implemented. Remember the idea that separate but equal mentality was integrated after the 14th Amendment? The Supreme Court ruled through Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation, in effect, was legal and it was allowed. Some people stood up for their rights at this time. An outspoken African-American activist, Ida B. Wells, we'll also read a document from her in the document booklet, came to public attention when she was denied a seat on a railroad car due to her race. She filed suit and won, but the ruling was overturned on appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court. From this event, she found her life's calling. She helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is also known as the NAACP, in 1909. Booker T. Washington was the foremost black educator in the 1890s. He believed that his race should first achieve economic stability, and that would ultimately provide for the advancement of their social status, which seems to make sense, kind of goes along with the same things that Frederick Douglass was saying about what the black man wanted. Booker Washington was opposed by W.E.B. Du Bois, who worked for immediate acceptance of an equal status of blacks with their white neighbors. Du Bois was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard. He earned it in history, and he also co-founded the NAACP. Now we've talked a little bit about what was going on in the South. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the West. The West transition was primarily populated by young men in their 20s who were mostly of white descent who had been disenchanted with what was going on in the East. There were some blacks who went west. There were some Mexican Americans, Hispanic people, but it was mostly this group of men who were unsettled and didn't know what they wanted to do with their life and were enchanted by the idea that they could move west, they could live in this free space, herd cattle, ride horses. That heard lots of tales of, how there was a lot of opportunity in the West. However, a lot of the ideas portrayed in movies of how the West was are not correct. Much of what was going on in the West was extremely boring. Life there was, one day of excitement and 20 days of just boring chores. And it perpetuated this idea of the free-loving, adventure-seeking cowboy that enchanted a lot of young men to go out west. Here's a picture of what's called a sodbuster. A sod house. It was so expensive to get materials and everything out west that they would build house out of mud bricks, and they would put sod on the roof to keep the rain out until they could afford to ship more supplies from like Chicago on the railway. Wood was really expensive because there weren't that many trees growing out on the plains, even though it was great for farming. They say that the primary focus of the West, the exciting part of the West was the cowboy and the cattle ranchers, but the bread and butter of the West was the farmer. And as unexciting as that life was, they're the ones who settled the West and helped bring prosperity out to this arid, crazy country that was so different from anywhere else than back east. Between 1870 and 1900, Americans settled more land in the United States than had been occupied before the Civil War. The land was a mixture of curses and blessings in the Great Plains. Farmers found fertile soil, but it was difficult to till the prairie grass and soil. And in the Southwest, the harshness of the Great American Desert barred passage to the California coast. Can you imagine crossing Arizona with no places to stop and eat? It would be really difficult. Settlers comprised many different nationalities. There were Chinese, African Americans, Mexicans, European immigrants, and just Americans who'd been born in the States. They were all searching for a new life. Following the Civil War and being given their freedom, thousands of freedmen, known as exodusters, immigrated west. The black exodus would die out in the 1880s because many of them were unprepared for the harsh living conditions on the plains, which is saying something considering that they had just come from the harsh living conditions of slavery. So that tells you how hard life was in the West. The gold rush of 1849 established the pattern for the search for precious minerals. A mineral would be discovered like silver, gold, or copper, and a rush of prospectors would flock to the area. Businesses would follow to provide for the needs of the men. That would be the development of small towns. When the mine panned out, prospectors would race to make the next discovery, and then the city would die out. Near the end of the 19th century, individual miners were replaced by large companies that used machines to mine, and this boomer bust cycle in the West died out. Settlement of the New West escalated aggression between the Indians and the settlers. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Indians today. There was continued aggression with them, and the violence on both sides came back to the what dated back to the early 1600s when the colonists first arrived. Remember that many of the tribes were hostile toward one another, often at war prior to the arrival of the colonists. And during this time, like the mid 1800s, line of the frontier, the frontier continued to move west. First, it started at the Mississippi River, and then it was St. Louis, and it just kept moving farther and farther west. Excuse me. As that line moved farther west, Native Americans who had been forced west by treaties and decrees from Congress once again found white settlers encroaching on land that once had been promised to the Indians. In the Colorado Territory, the Cheyenne and Lakota tribes fought back. They began to butcher and slaughter travelers as they passed through or attempted to settle their land. There were two chiefs, their names were Black Kettle and White Antelope, who had secured a peaceful resolution in 1864 for tribes in Colorado. These two chiefs promised not to attack any travelers in return for safety of their own tribe. Sadly, their peace was not secured. Colonel John Chivington was given permission by the governor of Colorado to attack the retaliating Cheyenne tribes. On November 29, 1864, the drunk colonel commanded his men to attack the very Cheyenne village that had been the peacekeeping tribe. Over 100 people in the village were killed, and they were mostly women and children. This whole treatment of the Indians is one of the hardest truths to face as an American studying American history. How horribly both sides treated each other, but in the end, really how cruelly the Indians were treated by the white settlers. Perhaps one of the most well-known of the Indian Wars involved Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who was a Civil War veteran, and this was in Montana. Miners had been encroaching on the Black Hills and Dakota Territory in search of gold, violating the Black Hills Reservation of the Sioux Indians. It was led by Sitting Bull. You may have heard of him. Custer and his detachment of 210 soldiers moved against a Sioux encampment only to find themselves surrounded by over 2,500 warriors. Custer and all of his men were killed. This was called the Battle of Little Bighorn and is also known as Custer's Last Stand. While the Sioux tribes were celebrating and continued hunting the U.S. gathered forces and responded to the attack. They pushed the Sioux tribes out of the mining encampment and onto reservations. Many of the tribal members could not survive the harsh conditions on the reservations. Another Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, was another tribe of the Sioux natives, and they were set on having their lands restored. A member of their tribe, his name was Wovoka, had become sick and had a vision of the spirit world. During his vision, he learned that a deliverer would come to rescue his people and restore them to their lands. The tribes took up a ceremonial dance called the Ghost Dance, and each new moon they did this to speed up the deliverance from the white man. This dance spread quickly and started making the U.S. authorities worried that there would be attacks, so they banned the dance. Soldiers were sent to keep the situation in check. In the process, a nervous soldier fired on a group of surrendering Indians in South Dakota, causing others to think that a battle had commenced. Led by the Sioux chief Bigfoot, the battle at Wounded Knee killed nearly 200 Indians and 25 soldiers. Wounded Knee marks the end of the Indian Wars, which were generally very brutal and were full of misunderstanding on both sides of the war, of the battles. Here's a map of some of the primary Indian battles that were fought as the white settlers moved west. A lot of them there you can see they're in Minnesota and the Dakota Territories in Montana. You can see where the Battle of Little Bighorn was. Some down in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is also a state like Arizona that has a lot of Indian reservations. You can see a couple of the massacres that happened in Colorado. It really is kind of a dark time for the United States to have to face the treatment that we had for these natives who had been there. Now, they weren't always kind to the white settlers, to be sure. It was a very difficult time. There were two sides to the argument, and both sides could have treated the other better. So with that, I already talked to you about the Little Bighorn. Here is some of the information. George Custer was just we'll talk about him in class, but he was so proud that he went to his death screaming and yelling and trying to kill all the Indians that he could, even when he was surrounded. So it's kind of an interesting story. We'll talk about it in class. That's it. No assignment for this. Please bring your notes from this presentation. We'll talk about them after we prepare for your essay, after you take your essay test. So be prepared, study. I will see you in class on Tuesday.